I'm Richard Louie at MSNBC headquarters right here in New York City, and we're honoring the life and legacy of the country's 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush. He passed away last night at his home in Houston at the age of 94. His passing comes 7 months after that of his wife, former First Lady Barbara Bush. However, in those 94 years, Mr. Bush was not short on achievements. He was one of the youngest aviators to serve in Navy history. A congressman, an ambassador, CIA director, vice president, all prior to taking to the White House and Oval Office. Now, his presidency saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he famously launched Operation Desert Storm along with coalition forces to drive Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government out of neighboring Kuwait. Right now, as a tribute, flags are flying at half-staff outside the White House and the U.S. Capitol building. We're going to start our team coverage of Bush 41's passing. We'll bring in MSNBC correspondent Garrett Hake, who is in Houston for us live. We also have NBC News correspondent Tammy Leitner, who is inside the H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station, Texas. Garrett, let's start with you, though, and this is the town of George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, that's right, Richard. This has been his hometown off and on since the late 1960s, again since 1993, where he returned after losing the White House in that bid against Bill Clinton in 1992. And this will be where he comes back to after the first part of the state funeral ceremonies begin in earnest this week. We're getting new details from the Capitol about what that will entail. The president's remains will arrive at the Capitol Monday evening, and members of the public will be invited to see the former president lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda until Wednesday morning. That's when that state funeral will take place, Wednesday during the day. The president has said, President Trump has said he will attend along with First Lady Melania Trump. Then things will move back down here to Texas for a final funeral mass or a funeral at St. Martin's Church here, the family's longtime church here in the Houston area, before things will head out to College Station, where, as Tammy can tell you, that's where the president will be buried with, beside his longtime wife, Barbara Bush, who passed away this spring. Richard.
Tammy, you are in College Station right now, you're there, H.W. Bush Library. Tell us, what is the tone there? I know you were speaking with many of the folks that have been coming through today.
Yeah, Richard, you know, people are somber. They're coming here to remember him. People have been lined up since early this morning. This is set, the museum and library, on 90 acres. And I'm told this is the most photographed room in the entire museum. People can come and actually sit behind a replica of his desk. There's also some family photos back here that takes you through when he was president, before and after, decades of his life. Very intimate photos. And I want to show you guys one other thing. Come down here. In the second drawer of his desk, he kept his baseball glove from his time at Yale. It shows you really what was important. They've spared no details here. I want to show you guys one other thing. If you can come over here, this is where kept the phone to the Pentagon. And he was one of the only presidents, I was told, to use what's called a partner desk, so that somebody could sit on one side while he was on the other side. As I mentioned, I've been speaking with people all morning. Steve and Aaron, you've lived here for 15 years, right. And you said that even though President Bush didn't live here full time, he was really a part of this community. Absolutely. How is that?
Well, so he would come into town anytime there was a major event in our community, whether it was a sporting event for football or baseball games. He was truly engaged. You could go to a restaurant here in town. He'd be out at Outback Steakhouse, quite honestly. You sit down there, and all of a sudden, President Bush comes in. You got the kids who are working out at the Student Recreation Center. They'd be working out on the elliptical, and all of a sudden, George Bush would just walk up and work on the machine right next to him. I don't truly think you can quantify how much President Bush has had an impact on our community on so many different levels. It's not like A&M was a small school in the 90s when this came here, but it's grown exponentially. Our community is so much better, so much richer because of President Bush.
Thank you so much. And really quickly, why did you come out today? Today of all days, it's an important day. What was it? Why did you want to come here today?
You know, today is a day of remembrance for one of the greatest men to ever walk this earth in so many ways. And, you know, just here to show my respect and, you know, remember good old 41.
Thank you, guys. Well put. Appreciate it. And Stephen, one other thing, as Garrett mentioned, President Bush will be laid to rest here. There's a spot about 200 yards from the library where Barbara Bush was buried 7 months ago. And normally people can go and pay their respects, but right now it is closed off in preparation for his burial. Richard?
Garrett Hake, Tammy Leitner, the very latest for us there in Texas. Thank you both so much. You know, we're also learning this hour more about President Bush's final moments. A New York Times article, Where Are We Going? George Bush's Final Days. It gives us insight to the president's state of mind through an interview with one of his closest friends. Joining us now by phone is the author of that article, Peter Baker. Peter, thanks for being with us. I know that it's a very busy day, but give us what you heard about those final moments for George H.W. Bush.
Right. Well, President Bush has been fading the last few days. Of course, he was 94, has been suffering for years from a form of Parkinson's disease. Last few days, he hadn't been getting out of bed. He hadn't really been eating all that much. And his friend Jim Baker, the former Secretary of State, stopped by to see him yesterday morning. And he found that he kind of became a little bit more alert. He opened his eyes and said, "Where are we going, Baker?" Baker said, "We're going to heaven." And Bush says, "That's where I want to go." So these are some really poignant moments. Secretary Baker also told me that he was there when President Bush passed away last night around 10:10 local time in Houston. He said his last words were to his son, President Bush 43, who was on a speakerphone telling him goodbye. He said he was a wonderful dad. He said, "I love you." His father said back to him, "I love you too."
Peter, what was the health of the former president leading up to these final moments?
Well, you know, he's been frail now for years. He's been stuck in a wheelchair, which frustrated him enormously. He's a physical man, had always been a physical, athletic man all his years. He wasn't able to talk or as easily as he once would. I think that frustrated him as well. But he's a fighter. There were multiple times in the last few years when he would show up at the hospital and people thought that this is going to be the end. Even after Barbara Bush passed away last spring, he headed to the hospital pretty soon afterwards. People thought, well, this might be that moment. But he's always been a fighter. What Secretary Baker told me is this time he was ready. This time he knew he wasn't going to keep fighting. In fact, he gave instructions to his medical team not to bring him to the hospital. He didn't want to do that again. He wanted to die in his own bed in Houston.
And Peter, as has been said, these were close friends, best friends. And it goes in your piece when you describe what Secretary Baker, that he was massaging the former president's hands and feet.
Yeah, it is a close friend. It's an extraordinary friendship in politics. You don't see a president and secretary of state the way you ever saw these two. They were friends before politics. They were partners on the tennis courts at the Houston Country Club way back when they were young men. In fact, their partnership in politics predates Secretary Baker ever becoming involved. Jim Baker's first wife passed away when he was 40, and George Bush, his good friend, enticed him to come into politics as a way of dealing with his grief. And they spent a lot of time over the next 2 decades basically ascending to the heights of American power and then running the world at a pretty critical moment as President and Secretary of State during the end of the Cold War and the war in Iraq.
And as you said in the final lines of your article about these final moments, you said there was no prolonged period of labored breathing. At 10:10 p.m., the former president was gone. If those things could be sweet, Mr. Baker said, and you're alluding to Secretary Baker, Secretary Baker says it was sweet. Peter Baker, thank you so much, Chief White House Correspondent over there at the New York Times. Always a pleasure to have you fill us in on, especially on moments like this. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All righty. And for more now, I'd like to turn to Andy Card, MSNBC political analyst and former White House Chief of Staff under George W. Bush. We have Giancarlo Parasuti, former aide to President George H.W. Bush, and Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian. Giancarlo, let's start with you. You worked with him. This has not been certainly easy years for you as you've watched him struggle at times. And yesterday at 10 p.m. was the moment.
It was, and I didn't know that until I woke up this morning and looked at my phone and knew that something had happened. And I felt great sadness wash over me, and I knew that many other people in this country, who some of whom were fortunate, as I was, Secretary Card, who we'll hear from in a minute, certainly was, to get to know him on an intimate level, and America lost a true hero. And obviously we lost the former president, but we also lost possibly the most decent man to ever assume the office of the presidency, and one of certainly the best human beings that I've ever had the privilege to get to know.
Andy, and let's work off what Giancarlo said there. What's your perspective now that we are thinking of, and there's many notes to be looked at, the last World War II president?
Well, George H.W. Bush defined the noble public servant, and he was a man of great character and a true citizen, not just of the United States, but a citizen of the world. And I found him to be a phenomenal role model. His life is a life that we should all aspire to live. And I'm not talking about the wealth or the success or the political success. I'm talking about how he cared for other people. He is about as loving a person as I've ever met. He didn't even remember that his enemies were his enemies. He would make friends out of former enemies, and people had to remind him, they're your enemy. And he said, oh, that was then, now is this. And just witness the relationship between President Bush and President Clinton. And President Clinton kind of considered himself as a son of George Bush. And George Bush considered him a son too. And it was just a remarkable experience to witness him so many times find love and share it and make sure that we all could benefit as a result of it. So on so many levels, I think the greatest legacy that he left was actually the legacy of the students at the Bush School. He cared deeply about creating that school, and he didn't want it to be just a place where people would come and give speeches. He wanted it to be a school where students came to be trained to enter public service. And graduates are doing that, and they will continue to, I think, emulate the life that George H.W. Bush lived as they serve. And that is a wonderful legacy, and that's why the Bush School was so important to the president, and he was so committed to its success, and I was privileged to be part of that effort on so many different fronts. But it's just a joy to see the students of the Bush School living their lives the way George Bush lived his, and performing in public service and being an example to others so that they would want to get into public service. Too few people today want to jump into the political arena. George H.W. Bush did, and he made it a better place because he did.
For half a century, Michael Beschloss, when you chronicled all of our presidents, where does he fit in, and what will he mean going forward? And as Andy was telling us, look at the students moving forward that will want to serve.
Well, I think one thing, it touches exactly on what Andy said, is that this was a man who had almost every virtue that you'd want to see in your own children. And one of them we so rarely see nowadays is modesty. This was an amazingly modest man. If you met him, he would be looking to set you at ease, not trying to impress you with his magnificence. And in history, sometimes you want a certain president to do a certain thing at a certain moment in history, and if we're rewinding the tape to the period from 1989 to 1993, what you'd want is a president who was capable of winding up the Cold War on the best terms possible. That's what George Bush did better than any other conceivable person who could have been president during those years.
He was the right person at the right time here, Giancarlo, in our history, being a Cold War, a Cold War kid myself, and having to live through all of that.
Yeah, no, for certain. And you look at the decisions that he made that were controversial at the time, most notably the pressure that was on him to dance on the wall when it fell between East and West Berlin, and he resisted that urge because he knew that it could be a provocation to the Soviets, who were slowly becoming the Russians. And in hindsight, every credible historian said that that was the right thing to do. It could have scored him easy political points, probably boosted his reputation with a cohort of the Republican Party that it turns out he desperately needed, but he didn't, because it wasn't the right thing to do. And he did do the right thing, and the world and America are better off for it.
All right. Thank you, Andy Card, Giancarlo Parasuti, Michael Beschloss, all three of you, for your perspective on this important day. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.